I call the Honourable Nathan Guy.
Yeah, thanks very much for an opportunity to make a call on what is a very important bill, even though it's a very small bill. What it does is just a band-aid on an expiry date for South Island processors. But the substantive point that I want to make is it's kind of interesting that the government chose to put the House in urgency for this bill yesterday and then took it out of urgency last night, and now we're back debating it not in urgency. So it is kind of bizarre, and to have the Leader of the House in the chair this afternoon, it would be quite good to hear from him about his strategy. Sure. Because what I found rather ironic is there was no discussion with opposition parties that I'm aware of, and I've canvassed it with my colleagues last night, no discussion from the Minister about putting the House into urgency for what is really just a small technical date change. I find it really hard to fathom that the House was thrown into urgency yesterday to debate a very technical change on this bill. And yet here we are this afternoon, now not in urgency. I think, Mr Chair, while you're referring me to refer back to the bill, I'm happy to do that. But here we are today, now that this bill isn't so urgent as it was yesterday. And I think had the government not been so arrogant to presume that we would just tick this through under urgency yesterday without making the full speeches that we made, and they were full of content, not of rhetoric, because we know how important this bill is to the primary sector and indeed to the dairy industry. So I would appreciate hearing from Mr Hipkins this afternoon as to why this bill was urgent under all stages yesterday, and now suddenly it's not so urgent. And what I would also want to hear from the Minister is to why there couldn't have been a truncated select committee period. Because you would think for a bill that is significant to the South Island, probably 4,000 suppliers in the South Island, certainly I would think there's 50,000 jobs that are created in the dairy industry in New Zealand, so let's presume there's probably 20,000 odd in the South Island, that it would warrant the Select Committee having a look at it. Yes, Mr Hipkins will no doubt get up and say, oh, it's just a technical one, it's a date change, but there's a whole lot of things that could have been included in this bill that we are debating in the committee stage this afternoon that isn't. And those things are going to be swept off to a review. And we spent quite a bit of time yesterday referring to the review. We finally heard from Minister O'Connor the review is going to take 12 months. But we didn't hear, is the review going to be run by MPI, MB, the Treasury? Is there going to be any independence? He actually offered up to me yesterday, it's not you, Mr Chair, but Minister O'Connor, that I could nominate, or we could choose to nominate people for a sort of panel or committee. Then he also went on to say that it would have been great if he could have brought the terms of reference to the debate yesterday, because that would have helped the fulsome nature of debating this part that we are now debating in the committee. But he couldn't do that because anyone with any dairy industry experience within MPI was focused on M. bovis cattle disease. I find that a little bit hard to fathom when there's about 2,500 officials that work in the Ministry for Primary Industries. So concluding my contribution this afternoon is we support this technical change on the National Party, but it would have been good to have had the discussion prior to leading up to urgency yesterday, because we saw that as a a real sort of breach of our confidence on this side of the House that there was no... Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Chris Hipkins.
Thank you.